From Nate Diaz's career-ending fight against McGregor to Anderson Silva's horrible loss at UFC 168, here are the rematches that really backfired on UFC fighters. Now, everybody loves a good build-up to a fight, and nobody does it better than pro trash talkers like Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz. So, fans were hyped whenever these two were in the octagon together. And by the time their rematch happened at UFC 202, the fight was already being called the Clash of the Decade. And considering it was making headlines all over, it wasn't an overreaction. When their first match ended at UFC 196, it had generated an insane revenue of $80 million. I mean, it's not every day that McGregor gets forced to submit in the second round. So with Conor begging for a rematch and Diaz looking for that 2-0 win, fans finally got to see these two in the ring again in August of 2016. And like always, both fighters didn't disappoint. The arena was electric as the fight kicked off, and to be fair, for the first few rounds, it was a really close fight. With McGregor taking an aggressive approach and Diaz being the punishment-absorbing machine he is, it was a back-and-forth battle from start to finish. The crowd was on the edge of their seats as both fighters were putting on the show of a lifetime, with the fight lasting for 5 intense rounds. In the end, the decision went to the Irishman for his precise attacks. But while Conor was able to bounce back after this win, I bet Diaz considers this fight as one of the biggest mistakes in his career. Because not only did he lose his 3-fight winning streak, but he also struggled to land any matches after that. Conor literally ended Diaz's career that night, but he wasn't the only star to end an era like that. Because Max Holloway single-handedly ended Jose Aldo's career at UFC 218 on December 2nd of 2017. This was one of the most hyped-up fights in the featherweight division, as their first clash at UFC 212 had ended in a stunning third-round TKO victory for Holloway. So Jose Aldo entered the octagon ready to get revenge. Now, just to give you a little context, Aldo was one of the strongest fighters in his division at that time. He'd defended his title over 7 times and established a 10-year win streak. That is, of course, until he met an opponent like no other. Within 3 rounds, Jose was on the floor because of Max's powerful right uppercut. So for him, this was the chance to prove he still had what it took to become a champion. Unfortunately for Jose, their second match was even worse. From the opening bell, Holloway was showing off his superior punching style. And after landing a few critical hits, he finally overwhelmed the Brazilian enough to score another third-round TKO. For the second time, Max came out on top, successfully defending his featherweight title and solidifying his status as the new big thing in the featherweight division. As for Jose, well, even though he was able to pick himself off the canvas after UFC 218, I can't say the same about his career. I mean, imagine having only 4 knockout losses in your career, and 2 of them belong to the same man. That's a lifelong rivalry right there. But while I'm on the topic of fighters with major beef after a rematch, I have to mention the rematch between Deiveson Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno, because it will be remembered as the ultimate underdog victory in UFC flyweight history. Moreno was on the Legacy Fighting Alliance roster for 2 years before their first fight. So when he finally got a shot at the big league, he made sure to put on a show like no other. Coming off of a 3-win streak, he was more than ready to show Deiveson what he was made of. And he did just that, with his amazing TKO win over the seasoned vet. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd be pretty angry if I lost in the 3rd round to a rookie like Brandon. So when their rematch fight finally rolled around, many expected this to be the fight of the year. But while it was still a pretty good fight, it looked like a clear mismatch. Like, at least their first clash had a good back-and-forth struggle. At UFC 263, however, Moreno had complete control of the situation throughout, and it honestly looked like Figueiredo was just there to take hits. It took only 3 rounds for Brandon to force a submission, and just like that, the Mexican cemented his place among the best UFC fighters ever. As for Deiveson, well, that embarrassing loss was a major hit on his reputation, as well as his 6-fight winning streak. The fighter's confidence took a nosedive after that result, and he probably wishes he could have skipped the rematch altogether. But while this match backfired badly on Figueiredo, the rematch between Gray Maynard and Frankie Edgar was even more chaotic. Because when these two entered the ring at UFC 125, everyone was anticipating a boring match. After all, they weren't exactly famous for having clear-cut wins. But nobody could have expected what happened on January 1st, 2011. UFC 125 was one of the most thrilling clashes to ever take place inside the octagon. And although it was called a draw after a dramatic 25 minutes, it only set the stage for UFC 136. So when these two top lightweight contenders met again at the main event in Houston, Texas, fans were ready for another showstopper. And I couldn't be more jealous of people who got to watch this live, because each round was more intense than the previous. With Maynard taking control once more and almost finishing Edgar in the opening round, everybody was losing their mind. But after getting so close to almost winning it all in their first fight, Frankie wasn't going to make the same mistakes twice. So, 4 minutes into the fourth round, he came back to settle the score, knocking out Maynard with a barrage of left punches and a short right hand. It makes perfect sense why this match is called one of the best title fights ever. But even then, nothing comes close to the commercial success of BJ Penn and Frankie Edgar's rematch. Because if your first match is outshining the main event of the night, the second one is a guaranteed success too. Frankie's victory at UFC 112 was dubbed the biggest upset of 2010. And just to put Edgar's win in perspective, Penn had not suffered a defeat since 2002 in his division. So you can see why his loss came as a surprise to everyone, and considering all the judges also had different scores, it's safe to say even they were shook at the result. The thing was, Frankie completely dominated inside the octagon with his quick reflexes and accuracy, and Penn was unable to use any kind of defense. So when their rematch happened at UFC 118 on August 28, 2010, people were tuning in from all over. And after such a controversial first fight, many expected Penn would regain his championship belt. As both fighters entered the octagon with something to prove, the stakes couldn't have been higher. However, the rematch didn't go as Penn had hoped. And once more, Frankie used his superior footwork to his advantage. Edgar's quickness and constant movement made it difficult for Penn to find his rhythm and land significant shots. And throughout the 5-round fight, Penn was overpowered. In the end, the judges' scorecards agreed with everything fans had seen that night. Edgar was just a much better fighter overall, and that was the end of Penn's era of dominance in the UFC. That fight just showed how quickly the landscape changes in the sport, and Anderson Silva's horrible loss at UFC 168 only proved that. The Spider and Chris Weidman squared off on December 28, 2013, in what was arguably the biggest match of his career, and the audience was ready for the drama. Since these two had already fought it out at UFC 162, fans knew it was a do-or-die situation for them, because Silva wanted revenge for his knockout defeat, while Weidman was looking for a second win against a UFC legend. And I have to admit, Anderson came very close to getting it, because while Chris struggled to keep up, Silva was on a roll, especially with his powerful strikes. But in the second round, just as Chris was getting comfortable, all hell broke loose, because as Silva was going for a kick to Chris's midriff, Weidman responded with a hit to the knee. He was hoping to push off the attempt, but he ended up badly injuring Anderson's leg. As the veteran fell to the ground in pain, refs rushed in to stop the match and give him medical attention. Chris's hit had literally snapped his bone in half. Although Silva ultimately made a comeback in January of 2015, it was obvious to all that his performance had taken a big hit. The industry received a wake-up call from UFC 168 that even the smallest error can cause a major injury. As for Silva, well, it was a big realization that revenge isn't everything. So, there you have it, from Anderson Silva's horrible loss at UFC 168 to Nate Diaz's career-ending fight. Those were the rematches that really backfired on UFC fighters.